This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research in humanities and human sciences more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions around our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkinen, and I might want to start with just one curious data point. If I open the Wikipedia page on the largest empires in history, I find a big list. It's a lot of stuff in there. And it's confusing. But if I zoom out, every single one of the largest empires of their day was grown from the soil of Eurasia, with the sole exception of Egypt. Now, I could do the same thing with a list of the inventions that have shaped the modern world, or military technologies, the most efficient weapons for mass slaughtering. Eurasia, time after time, whether it's China, India, Persia, the Mongols, the Abbasid Caliphate, or more recently, Western European colonial states. Why is it that, for better and certainly for worse, locations within Eurasia have always been at the forefront of military technology especially, but also information technology from paper to writing to mathematics, etc. And so much so that around 500 years ago, the western fringes of Eurasia were able to be the dominant power on all corners of the world. And how can we explain this while fighting against the oh-so-easy tendency to slip into racial stereotypes? Well, this was the task that led Jared Diamond to write his monumentally successful Guns, Germs, and Steel. My guest is someone who has built on top of Diamond's theory in trying to dig deep into the origins of global inequalities. And he's someone who's dug deeper than I've seen anyone else do before. Ideen Riahi is an associate professor of economics at the Baruch College, City University of New York. And he thinks that to understand this broad pattern of human history, and Eurasia's particularly important role in it, we have to understand not only the beginning of agriculture, but a time even much before that in the Ice Ages, and how human migrations throughout Eurasia shaped nature, shaped ecology, and paved the way into things that later allowed those Eurasians who so decided to dominate their neighbors with such force, building such large empires, and later expanding this business to faraway lands. I will let him tell you why. I really love this conversation because on the one hand, we'd really take a kind of bird's eye view of the biggest questions in human history, looking at different possible answers, and also asking the hard question of, should we try to find answers? Is there something generally problematic about this whole endeavor? Should we just focus on history as it unfolded in each pace with all of its intricacies, nuances, individualities? So on the one hand, this is a big picture discussion. But on the other hand, Riahi's own work is at the very cutting edge of this research. It combines ideas from economics, from climate science, from evolutionary biology into a really fascinating theory, which, if correct, has really deepened our understanding of the human story. So we really kind of get both a bird's eye view of the whole territory before a really deep dive into the murky waters of the ongoing research. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you do too. As always, you can look at the show notes if there are any technical terms, books, articles, etc. that you want to follow up on. And if you really enjoyed this and my work generally for On Humans, do show some support. You can just subscribe to On Humans on whatever player you're using. In show notes, you will also find a bunch of links of ways to keep update with my work, whether it's YouTube videos or a proper newsletter that you would like to most receive. You'll find links to all of that in the show notes. And finally, I want to thank each and every one of you wonderful people who will support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Your support really matters. Thank you so much for it. And if you're someone who might want to join that wonderful group of people, just head to patreon.com/onhumans. But that's enough for an intro. So whether you're commuting to work or exercising at the gym or just someone who wants to learn more about humans, it's great to have you with us. And I bring to you Ideen Riahi. Professor Ideen Riahi, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you, Ilari. I'm happy to be a small part of your amazing work.
Thank you so much. Pleasure is mine. Pleasure is mine. Do you have a paper starting with the question, why Eurasia? Can you unpack that question?
When we look at economic development throughout history, there's noticeable and visible differences in the level of development, both currently and historically, between Eurasia and other continents, other regions, or people of Eurasian descent and other people. So naturally, like one of the main questions of economic development, comparative economic development literature is to find out why this was the case. And there are amazing theories about this. The work of Osam, who you talked to a bit, European colonization, differences in agricultural development, cultural differences. So the why Eurasia question is try to look at what factor, particularly when it comes to deep history, contributed to earlier rise of agriculture in Eurasia, and particularly look at the question that Jared Diamond first talked about in his magnificent book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was the fact that Eurasia was particularly well endowed with domesticable species, particularly animals. So I was trying to figure out why that was the case.
Yeah, I think it's not the most obvious question that I see in this space. What I often see is why Europe? And you're absolutely right. The Diamond is famous for actually asking the question, why Eurasia instead of Europe? Now, kind of the point there is that, well, if you look at the last 10,000 years or whatever, this kind of technological military edge, it hasn't always been in Europe, but it has always been somewhere in Eurasia.
Yeah, like the rise of Europe is a relatively recent thing in human history. Like it is true that the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, and if you want to understand current inequality, we need to have a theory of why Industrial Revolution happened in Europe. And for that, you need to understand patterns of European colonization and expansion and what happened to the rest of the world. But if you look deeper into it, then for the most part of the past 10,000 years, the wealthiest part of the world, when, were in Middle East and China, most of the human trade happened between these regions. So it is not an exaggeration to say that Europe was built based on Neolithic legacy of the Middle East. And the genetic evidence that we have shows that most of the European population, particularly in the south, are descendant of farmers who migrated from Anatolia, which is now in Turkey and other part of the south. So Europe was completely transformed by Middle Eastern farmer by around 5,000-6,000 years ago.
It's really interesting when you look at the genetic evidence of what Europeans, I mean, the quote unquote white people just did not exist before very recently, when the blue-eyed, dark-skinned hunter-gatherers started mixing with the pale-skinned, dark-eyed Middle Eastern farmers. But anyway, you mentioned Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's one of these books that almost, I bet that most of the listeners have heard the name and some have read. But for the many of those who haven't actually read, or who read it, when it came out in 1997, maybe we should pause here to see what is left to be explained. I mean, what was really remarkable about the book is that it was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, but many of its theories answering this question, why Eurasia, are still relatively, they're still on the table. It's not one of these books that have been completely, debunked 10 years after its publication. So if you want to understand why Eurasia, maybe we should, by the way, add that because of Mediterranean trade, maybe we should talk about Afro-Eurasia, including Northern Africa, into this mix. What were Diamond's answers?
So, Diamond has a really good summary, one-sentence summary of his book, which is, I think, is very informative. And you have to understand the time he was writing the book. There was a lot of discussion about genes and the differences between genes and their role in wealth of nations and stuff. So his summary is that differences in human population with regard to their development is rooted in differences in environment and not on genetic or biological differences between population. And he goes through his book, which he tries to explain in the book, why descendant of Eurasian civilization, Europeans particularly, dominated the rest of the world after 1500. It's a task that before him, Alfred Crosby, another historian, has done in another book called Ecological Imperialism. So both of them, Diamond has much more detail and, up-to-date scientific evidence backing up his story, is that the main difference between Eurasia and other continents that they highlight is the difference in animal population, particularly animals that have the traits that allowed for human domestication of a species. And they show that this difference was so significant in terms of both invention of agriculture and productivity of agriculture, disease environments, rise in population density, increase in population size, transportation and trade. Deep down, both of them argue that the main reason for success of Eurasian civilization, broadly speaking, it doesn't mean all of Eurasia, but was that they were much better endowed with domesticable animals.
The importance of domesticable animals, why is that such a big deal? I mean, how much do you think that at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that it allows larger population densities, which then allow, well, for better or worse, all sorts of things that we tend to call civilization? Is that the answer for why having pigs, cows, sheep, goats is such a big deal?
First of all, when we say Eurasian civilization, it does not imply that there were no civilization in other countries, in Africa or in America. They were like magnificent civilization with highly complicated social structures and technologies. So it's a relative argument. Those animals like pig, cow, sheep, later horse and donkeys and all of those camels, they really contributed to the productivity of agriculture, but was through their byproducts by affecting soil fertility, cooling soils. So agriculture was much more productive, and they were source of wealth and surplus. Those animals, the herd animals. So it allows for wealth accumulation at a scale that wasn't possible in the absence of those animals. But contributed to inequality even within Eurasia, within Middle East, within Europe.
So those who had the animals were those with wealth.
Yes. But perhaps when it comes to the later event, particularly European colonization, other people might disagree with me, but I really believe that the main impact of them was, particularly when it comes to Old World versus New World, and why Europeans so in a really short amount of time were able to colonize America, with the differences that they cause in terms of disease environment, and the fact that indigenous population of the America were pretty much defenseless against European pathogens.
Yeah, this is the germs in the kind of germs and steel. And so how much is that related to animals?
Almost all of the Eurasian epidemic diseases that, infectious pathogen, at some point originated from animals and they adopted to humans. You can think of COVID as a recent example, similar process. And not just that, it was the fact that dense population lived in close proximity to animals in many areas of Eurasia, which provided the opportunity for those pathogens to jump, in a sense, to humans. So yeah, I think domesticable animals and herd animals contributed a lot to the differences in disease environment between Old World and New World.
What about the other part of Diamond's explanation? Because as a kind of very simplistic summary, he says that there are two things. One is this whole business about domestication, and Eurasia, for whatever reason, being the first to start domesticating animals and plants, taking in more calories from these domesticated plants and animals, having the animals that leads into the germs is a nice addition to that. But there is another part of his argument, which is that Eurasia is, first of all, really big. And secondly, it's an east-west supercontinent. There are no Silk Roads from Mexico to Peru, because you have to go through so many different climatic zones when you're moving south to north. Whereas when you're moving to east to west, you can move in relatively similar climatic zones, which leads into, Silk Roads is just a kind of catchword for this incredible amount of constant, movement of ideas between the east and the west, for the lack of a better word. And the reason that I think that some people might say that this is the more important part of Diamond's answer is that the germs were very, very, they were devastating for the Native Americans. But then when Europeans also did a pretty thorough job at colonizing Africa, every single country pretty much in Africa except for Ethiopia. Liberia is a bit of a funny example on the side, but leaving that aside, basically the whole of Africa. And there, the disease environment was certainly not in the European favor. And so in a sense, I guess the argument there would be that the one thing that really happened to be kind of culminating in Europe around those critical, 1500s, year 1500 or whatnot, was the fact that you just happened to have a lot of inventions, especially military inventions, but also information technology inventions, everything from guns to printing press to sailing boats with compasses, and that all of these things, if you trace where they come from, very, very few of those things is an indigenously European idea. And that it's actually this flow of ideas that the East-West orientation allows might be the most important explanation, because that doesn't only allow us to explain what happened in the Americas, but also what happens later in Africa, for example. So I could hear someone say that, look, we just don't really need anything else, really. The fundamental thing is that Eurasia is big, it's easy to move from east to west, you get a lot of intermingling of ideas, and when those start to coalesce in one place, for whatever reason in Europe at that time, you just happen to have so much military power that if you decide to do what Europeans did decide to do, you're going to end up ruling most of the world, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, I think the continental geography factor really important. I don't think they're as important as diamond portrayed them. So like let's focus on the America, because America is pretty big in terms of size. And you know, in terms of the orientation, the axis orientation, there's also a lot of possibility of east-west transfer and transportation and movement of population. And I'm sure they did. Like, you know, more recent evidence shows that those American civilizations were like much more advanced than we thought. They have much more complicated structures. The size of the population and population density was much larger. And those people moved around. And particularly, even you'll be surprised anything gonna teach humans from moving into new climates. Like, yeah, if we can do one thing is to move to new niche and then colonize it. So a lot of the things that Diamond says about the effects of continental geography more or less existed in a lot of regions. Maybe if you go deep down to South America, like you know, southern part, yes, that you lose a lot of benefits of the east-west orientation doesn't exist there, but there is a lot of those benefits that exist in northern parts of South America and in North America. Same is true in Africa. So I do think they're all important. Particularly the east-west orientation really helped all species throughout history in Eurasia to be able to disperse much more easily. But I think what is lacking from diamond theory is the fact that when you compare continents, yes, like, you know, a lot of the things that he said is correct. But again, that there's a lot of variation inside Eurasia that is really important, perhaps even more important than continental differences. Big chunk of interesting differences happened within Eurasia. And that's where my research coming, because what Diamond attribute to Eurasian civilization, it was only happening in the southern part of Eurasia. The low latitudes of Eurasia were particularly well endowed with domesticable animals, despite the fact that the species that were domesticated, let's say in Middle East, in India, in southern China, those species existed in most of Eurasia. The wild ancestor of cow and pig. So a theory of explaining the rise of Eurasian should explain not only continental differences, but what was it about the low latitudes of Eurasia, the southern stretch from pretty much Turkey to China, that was particularly conducive to domestication and agriculture. That is my focus. So trying to complement Diamond's theory and trying to figure out what was it about that region.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start moving towards your answer. But before we do, I just want one more question. You mentioned the fact that, for example, the American civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, whatnot, the population densities were very high. For example, they had very, very impressive urban planning that really impressed the Europeans, for example, when they came to Tenochtitlan, you know, Cortes and his companions. I mean, they were mesmerized when they came to Tenochtitlan. We've never seen anything like this. And so there is a kind of a current within history of people who want to say that the question we are asking doesn't really matter or doesn't even exist, because to understand the fall of the Aztecs, we have to understand you have to understand the haphazard decisions of the individual, a Tlaxcalan leader who decides to, join hands with these bearded Spaniards, and without whose support, there's no way Cortes could have achieved what he did in the time he did. So before we move on, can we just quickly motivate the question one more time against this worry that some people have, which is that, well, is there anything inevitable? Is there any kind of objective standard in which Eurasia was in any sense kind of on top of anything? Or was it just that, well, a few Europeans happened to get very lucky one after the other?
I don't think human history, the long span of human history, is inevitable. There is definitely individual and group choices that could have been made differently and would have resulted in significantly different histories. For example, to understand the fall of American civilization, we need to understand significantly more about what happened in South. That's completely true. But also, for example, those interactions and decisions were made in the backgrounds of significant climate fluctuation or resource constraint. And so this doesn't mean that those decisions didn't matter, but it informs us about the context and environment in which those decisions were made. So my answer to people who bring that sort of objection is that none of these approaches are by themselves going to be informative enough. We need to understand systematic patterns of geography and biogeography and climate, and we need to understand details of individual decision-making. And I agree with what you said that there is a lot of randomness and luck. and chance that results in something like rise of Europe and fall of other civilization.
Yeah, I have to say, like, to put my own cards on the table a little bit, I find it very frustrating when, for example, Diamond's book is bashed as just environmental determinism, which sees humans as lacking any agency. I think we need some new terms. I actually suggested the other day to my flatmate, maybe we should coin a new term of environmental realism, which is that it's not determined that, Tenochtitlan falls in the way it falls because of geography, but assuming that environmental factors, geography has played no role would be just so unrealistic. And it's so naive in the 21st century to assume that things like climate, just like, humans just do whatever they do. And you don't need to worry about what happens around you.
When I talk to sometimes my students, I try to tell them like more recent example, more understandable. There's like lots of evidence that like, the neighborhood you're being born, like in the US, the zip code, it really affects your educational attainment, it affects your life success and all. And there's a lot massive literature on why this is the case.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting example because that is something that people who typically would dislike environmental determinism in history would probably be very receptive to sociological literature on how inequality shapes, not necessarily the shape of every fate of every individual, but the big, structural.
It's not the fact that the particular latitude or the zip code in the US is prone to poverty or prosperity. It's about what happens to those people that live in a certain neighborhood as a result of decisions that are made at the time of that they're growing up in those neighborhoods and accumulation of decisions that have been made prior to that. That's where the history comes in.
So in the same way as we might ask, why does this one zip code end up, I don't know, sending so many students to Harvard? Yeah. And we probably want to avoid the idea that, well, the zip code has genetic superiority.
Believe it or not, people have said those things. So
and this is the whole point that Diamond makes, I think, so well, and which is so just undervalued by many of his critics, is that he says that, look, if we don't find a proper explanation for this kind of dominance of Eurasia, the implicit explanation that the lay people will have is some form of a racist theory of, well, these people are just kind of like smarter. And, those Africans and those Native Americans, well, it's just kind of like, there's something like, they're just not so innovative or something. Mm-hmm. And that his whole book is kind of dedicated to countering that tendency. And I think the zip code example is a wonderful way to make that point. But okay, I think we're ready. So we have the question, why Eurasia? Afro-Eurasia, if we can, to be more precise, but counting on the northern parts of Africa, holding the kind of edge of technology, at least military technology, often or many more kinds of technologies, writing, mathematics, whatnot. And you say that it's important to notice that one thing is that animals play a big part in this early start of agriculture and the importance of domesticated animals. This is not something that happens everywhere in Eurasia. It happens in this kind of this southern band of Eurasia, from Turkey to China, as you said. And Diamond kind of leaves it at that. He just says, well, they just had they just had good animals to domesticate. They had good wild grasses to domesticate. And you're suggesting that we can dig deeper, that there is a story to be told of why agriculture took on in these areas and why did animal husbandry take over these areas so much earlier and with so much force than in other parts of the world. Why?
So before answering your question, let me say one thing about agriculture. Of course, it requires domesticable species. So a big chunk of literature on the origins of agriculture is focused on plant species. But if you look at, again, continental differences, pretty much all the human population at some point domesticated some of their plants. Everything. Different timing, but they did. But what makes southern low latitudes of Eurasia particularly unique is the fact that pretty much all of the domesticable animals, large mammals particularly, those are like megafauna, those weighing more than 45 kilo. A lot of them coming from that region.
So the cows, the pigs, etc., goats. Wait, are goats over 45?
Yes.
Okay. I don't interact enough.
Surprisingly, they are. They don't look like it, but they are.
Okay, good to be clear on this. Yeah. The yaks, etc.
Llama, ancestors of llama and alpaca was domesticated much later, like around 4,000 years ago. they were fully homestead in the Americas. But let's just focus on the I.
But maybe that is important. Maybe we should put a pin on the point that not only is it so that there's maybe less species domesticated, but it also happens later in other parts of the world, such as America. That might be an important part of why the technological advantage was with Eurasia at the time of contact. Yeah,
It's really important, Kilos. So, as you said, Diamond provides some explanation for this abundance of these types of animal, but for the most part, he attributes it to chats. So since Diamond's publication, there has been a lot of a vibrant industry of research on this particular topic. And in the economic literature, pretty much all of the works that I have seen, they take the abundance of domesticable animal as it just happened to be the case, but nobody tried to explain why this was the case. Of course, because it's really difficult. It's not an economist's job to figure out why that was the case. But again, this is a really important part of the answer, because at the end of the day, we need to know why Eurasian species have the domesticable traits. Without explaining that, then all the explanation of what happened after that is incomplete.
Well, hold on a second. It's incomplete if there is an explanation for it. But of course, sometimes things do just happen to luck. And if they are due to luck, I think we should not try to find an explanation for what was pure luck.
Exactly.
But I'm with you that we should try our best to find if there is one.
Yes, we should try that. You should try. So I started looking at what happened before the invention of agriculture. What happened, because most of human history happened before the invention of agriculture. A lot of the interesting stuff happened, way before 10,000 years ago. One of them is climate change. Climate change was really important. The other one is human migration, starting around 100,000 years ago, our ancestors who were pretty much similar to us in terms of bipedal ability and cognitive ability and language and stuff, started migrating out of Africa. And one more thing happened was that a lot of animals around the time humans started migrating, particularly started around 40,000, 30,000 years ago, started going extinct as human population expanded out of Africa. And why does this matter? So in diamond theory, that matters. And before diamond, it was the economist Bernard Smith who talked about this. In the America, both of them referred to the extinction of animal in the America, and the fact that mass extinction of animal happened around the time human reached America, let's say 20,000 years ago, but probably earlier. So diamond explanation is that, but the fact that a lot of animals went extinct in America partly explained the fact that there wasn't enough in America. There wasn't enough large animals for domestication. A lot of them went extinct, native American horse went extinct around 10,000 years ago.
Yes, so it's not only that pure luck dictates that Eurasia has more domesticable animals, but partially some of the domesticable animals were killed in America.
Potentially domesticable, we don't know, but
yes, potentially domesticable animals went extinct. Yeah, it is wild, by the way. I mean, it's not just horse, but going through these megafauna extinctions, it's really funny to see all the kinds of animals that existed before these extinctions. There is just in the same way as we're so used to the African savanna being full of really cool looking big mammals. That kind of used to be the norm.
Yes, one of my favorite activities in here is going to a museum of natural history and looking at the fossils and imagining how this giant look like.
Yeah.
So when you look at, particularly in Africa, actually, a lot of the animals that existed, evolved with human, since our birth as a species, they're still there. So some species went extinct, but a lot of the species that we see today, they are the species that our ancestors dealt with. It's not the same in Eurasia and America. A lot of the species that human encounter went extinct in those other regions outside Africa.
Yeah, and am I right that also in Australia, for example?
Yes, Australia particularly lost a lot of the species, but Australia wasn't that diverse to begin with in terms of the evidence shows that. But America and Europe, they had a large variety of animals. So biologists and ecologists says we evolve in a world of giants. We stand on the shoulder of giants that do not exist anymore.
Yes, yes. So it's not just the mammoths. Mammoths, of course, being the most famous of these now extinct megafauna. But
there was a hint in Diamond and the work of other people about the importance of animal extinction. There were like hints that I could follow, but my idea was that this difference in extinction rate probably had a lot to do with the fact that low latitudes of Eurasia were so, particularly well endowed with domesticable species. And then I kind of like embarked on a 10-year journey of figuring out why that was the case.
Yeah, yeah. Well, why is that the case?
So in the case of Eurasia, like a lot of the species that were eventually domesticated in the low latitudes, they existed in Europe, they still in high latitude, but they weren't domesticated there. Then I started looking deeper into the geographic location and of the ancestor of domesticable species. You see that like a lot of these species were located in regions that were settled and occupied since the humans out of African migration, starting from our distant cousin Homo erectus, which migrated out of Africa around 2 million years ago, a little later. So Homo erectus in the, as a joke probably in biology, used to show it's called the meat man or the elephant man because it was following meat.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. They were like really into meat.
Okay, I hadn't actually heard that before. That's cool. Yeah, okay. So they follow the meat all the way to Indonesia.
Yes, and the research that has been done shows that Homo erectus just was going back and forth between Eastern Asia and Western. Like they weren't like, they were really following the herds.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Again, like, you said, like, there might not be any explanation for what we are trying to explain, but like, it's kind of like feels like a really big coincidence that the areas outside Africa that were settled by human species first and continuously since Homo erectus migration happen to be regions that have the highest endowment of all kinds of domesticable plants and animals. And same regions happen to be they were occupied by Homo sapiens also around when they migrated out of Africa, and agriculture happened in the same areas. So I was like, this is not a coincidence. There should be a little bit more to it.
Okay, so the meat man, the Homo erectus, they run east to west, on this wonderful east-west axis that we already discussed. And somehow from under their footsteps rises these wild grasses and these big mammals that just happen to be the ones that we now look at as, oh, these were great to domesticate.
Right.
Very convenient. Okay, I see. So let's continue. So what do the stampeding rounds of the Homo erectus running behind the meat, how do they explain domesticability much later on when because we're talking about the domestication only happens like a blink of an eye before present when we think about like a 2 million year period.
Yes. I grew up in Iran, we didn't really learn anything about evolution there that much.
Oh, I see. That wasn't high on the agenda. Okay.
Yes, I was really interested because it was something that I didn't know. And when you're thinking about deep history, but you have to think about evolution. So then I started learning, from the evolutionary perspective, what was the process of domestication? Because, Diamond attributed to chance, but later theory argued that these species evolved to have those traits that allowed for their domestication. So how did those species evolve is a subject of a really interesting literature, and there's no final answer, but
if someone wants to dig into that literature, will there be one place to start, one book or one article to start from?
Yes, there are particularly, I don't want to minimize anybody's work. So there are lots of good papers, but particularly the ones that are easily accessible. And I really like an article by Melinda Zeder and Bruce Smith called Conversation on Origins of Agriculture.
Okay, I'll link that in the show notes. Yeah.
So the idea was that, okay, these species evolved as a result of, something that happened. And then the question is, what is those things that resulted in evolution of a species in ways that resulted in later those species being domesticable? That's where the extinction comes in, because think about a tribe of humans and they rely on large mammals. They all human population in Eurasia particularly relied on large mammals for survival. The climate was, the ice age climate was particularly harsh in a lot of regions, and meat was the main source of food. So if there is a threat of extinction, then humans gonna try, as we've seen throughout history, even now, if a common resource, like herds of animals that is common to different groups of humans, is in the danger of extinction, not extinction, but the danger of extinction reduction. Population humans who really depends on this animal, they're gonna try to save it. They're gonna try to save their resources so that they can sustain themselves. So there's a change in human behavior regarding probably hunting. So instead of just hunting these animals and not coordinating with probably other human tribes and not worrying about it because they're so abundant, then if they become threatened, then people have to coordinate in order to save the species. So the change in human behavior means that there is a co-evolutionary impacts on other species. So other species that are managed in a sense by humans in terms of movement, in terms of when to hunt them, in terms of which, not hunting the females, not hunting the babies, and all of those things, gonna evolve over time to depend on human behavior for their own survival. So there's a co-evolutionary sort of an arms race between predator and prey that results in both species to depend on each other for survival. And, the resource management strategy eventually resulted in species that were sort of ready for agriculture.
Yeah. How much, if at all, is there evidence of I know that there's evidence from just before agriculture. There are these moments where it's not really agriculture, but you might be like sedentary hunter-gatherer who harvests wild barley, like the famous Natufians. And in the same way, you might have a moment before animal domestication where you don't really have a domesticated animal. They haven't genetically yet changed that much, but they might be a tamed animal in some sense. And you might be like herd management is the technical term. And so, yeah, sure, those things do happen. I think that's uncontroversial. But those things happen, we had evidence of them happening just before the beginning of the proper agriculture and proper animal husbandry. But we started talking about Homo erectus, the meat man, running across Eurasia 1.8 million years ago or something like this. So do we have any evidence for this kind of very long process of kind of pre-agricultural management, human management of herds or human management of wild grasses? Or is that for now a theory that could explain some later patterns, but we have no evidence of it?
We don't have any direct evidence of any sort of human behavior when you go a little further than even 10,000 years ago. The evidence is highly indirect. But if you go, let's say 20,000 years ago or even 30,000 years ago, the further you go, more patchy the evidence. We do not have, let's say, genetic evidence that show that humans, like in the Middle East, hunter-gatherers 40,000 years ago were behaving in a specific way. At least I haven't seen anything that far. It's kind of unreasonable to expect evidence to be that easily available. But we have evidence that humans significantly impacted their environment. Not just that, but systematically. That is the systematic intervention in the environment that is matters, and there's evidence of it. Probably this doesn't apply only to Homo sapiens, our ancestor, probably other human species. The evidence that we have shows that they were all significant ecosystem engineers in an ecological terms, or niche constructors.
Yeah. I just recently saw a paper about this in Australia, I believe, about systematic use of fire.
Yeah.
To modify ecosystems, way back.
Yeah. People think of hunter-gatherers as people just walking around and grabbing things and putting them. No, it wasn't like that, right? Humans were they were a division of tasks, and people have detailed traditional ecological knowledge. People call it TEK. These hunter-gatherers, they knew what they were doing. They had a pretty good idea of how the world works, and they managed their resources to a different extent, to the extent that their environment allowed them, to generally with the goal of making the environment even more stable. So it wasn't like that they were defenseless against all kinds of environmental change. Human manipulated environments to make their life easier, to become more fit in those environments. And I think agriculture broadly is the outcome of those sort of interventions. It happened in a lot of regions, but it's just happened in a different environment in low latitudes of Eurasia.
And so in the big picture is that that you're suggesting is not that these innocent hunter-gatherers were just doing things with wild beasts until suddenly they start domesticate them, and rather that there was a much more gradual process from what the creatures that we just have no idea what they were like, 1.8 million years ago. And slowly they started co-evolving with humans, depending more and more on humans, especially along this running track of Homo erectus and later other hominin species.
Yes, there is absolutely nothing spontaneous and sudden. Everything is gradual.
Well, can we then make the link between the human migration out of Africa and, or like more generally, why does this particular band of lands from the east-west axis, from Turkey to China, why more here than somewhere else? I mean, because you've already hinted that in America, the extinctions were more dramatic. We don't exactly know how much because of humans killing these animals versus, for example, climate change. Maybe we'll return to that at some point. But anyway, Africa, they were much, much less so. And so someone might say, well, hold on a second. Doesn't this theory predict that in Africa, where there's been even longer coevolution between hominin species and wildlife, this should be the cradle of agricultural and animal husbandry, which it certainly was not. Although they are independent of the origins of agriculture in Africa, they came later, they're less intense. Am I right that there's no animal domestication happening independently in Africa?
Yes, like it happened. Like I think donkey was originally domesticated in Egypt, but after the, much later when
and Egypt is difficult because it's so connected to this Eurasian landmass. Yeah.
And I think African cattle was domesticated after the arrival of Middle Eastern cattle there.
So you have this kind of inverse U shape where you suggest that there are areas where there's too little extinction for this whatever magic was happening in Eurasia to happen, and then there are places where there's too much extinction. For example, the Americas. Why such an inverse U shape? What explains it?
So there are theories about why extinction rates of large mammal was so different, this late wave of extinction that happened during Homo sapien migration. So Africa, very little extinction. Overall, Eurasia, relatively moderate extinction with like lots of extinction at the north, moderate extinction at the south, and America and Australia, mass extinction. So this has been known and people have been trying to explain it since I'm guessing the 20s. So in Africa, which was very little extinction for the most part, one theory is that African mammals evolved with different species of humans, including Homo sapiens. So it's kind of like they have seen us from when we were infant as a species.
They knew how to play the game.
Yes, the evolutionary arm race between predator and prey and all of those things resulted in this species having a really good insight, deep insight into human behavior. So they knew the bipedal tool-making ape very well. They have seen, they evolved alongside the evolution of everything that happened, all the important innovation that has happened in Africa. They have been there, done that. So they were familiar with Homo sapiens behavior by the time they started hunting. So this predator savviness, in the sense of African mammals, probably saved them from mass extinction. Now let's go to the American, exact opposite of this. So American species evolved for the most part completely in isolation. Up until 20,000 years ago, there were no truth-making apes. So naturally, these species have no idea of what they're dealing with. So by the time humans got there, I think this was during the last glacial maxima around 20,000 years ago that human got there, along with climate change and the hunting patterns of Homo sapiens, or changes in environment due to fire and all of those things, resulted in mass extinction. So they were part of the extinction explained by the fact that these animals were completely unfamiliar with human behavior. Not just animals, also American plants were unfamiliar with human behavior. So meaning that it was probably really difficult for this species to adjust to environments that were increasingly dominated by human presence, And this has implication in terms of size of the species, because smaller species generally evolve faster. Short generational species generally evolve faster. The larger the species and the heavier their investments on their offspring, becomes harder to them to adjust to sudden environmental changes. And Homo sapien arrivals along with sudden environmental changes changed the landscape of the America a lot, resulted in those mass extinction. So Eurasia was between these two, meaning that by the time Homo sapiens were started spreading, Eurasian species have seen different types of humans. They gradually exposed to Homo sapiens, so they had time to adjust. They weren't completely unfamiliar. So they weren't as familiar with human behavior as African species, but not completely unfamiliar. So this means that human presence resulted in significant threat to these populations, but alongside changing human behavior, these species could change. They had their kind of evolutionary potential to adjust to human presence. So extinction happened, but mass extinction at a scale that happened in America or Australia didn't happen. So humans had incentive to do their management strategies because there was some instability, enough instability in animal population, more than in Africa. Species had the potential to respond and had time to respond to human management. And most likely the combination of these two explain why low latitudes of Eurasia eventually became the cradle of mammal domestication. That's my broad story so far.
So if the broad story is that the traditional mistake we often make when thinking about the origins of any of these things that we think of the time before and then the time after. So you have these animals living in the Garden of Eden, and suddenly they're domesticated, and you say, no, there's a much more gradual buildup, probably towards the fact that you end up having a lot of these domesticable, not yet domesticated, but domesticable animals. What's important is to notice, for the purpose of this conversation, what's important to notice is just that there are certain kind of traits of these animals, not just running away when they see a human, that you think that have more gradually evolved in Eurasia. And so the predecessor of the cow, of the pig, and the goat, etc., they had already been slowly getting accustomed to this herd management of our ancestors. What does herd management, what does it look like? Can you just pick your favorite animal and give a little description of what it looked like 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago?
So, in the paper, I use the management, common resource management, to broadly refer to human systematic manipulation in environment, including when it comes to animals, right? So one thing for sure, humans, if you think about a hunter tribe, they want to control the movement of the prey species, right? They don't want to travel from, say, Iran to Europe following the herd. It is possible to happen that, but they want to control the movement. They want to make sure that the herd, they don't hunt the young, they don't hunt the, a pregnant female. They want to coordinate their hunting so that they can direct the herd into chill zones that is easily accessible to humans. That the evidence of that comes from the chill zone area that the tribe generally push the herd. So all of these is gonna invoke a response in animals. So it wasn't the intention of humans to make these animals like us or get close to us. It happened probably as byproduct of some sort of human behavior, particularly regarding hunting. Probably there are, for example, in the case of, let's say dog and pig, these species were attracted to human for the most part because they were food around human. Second, wherever there were a group of human, there were food that these animals could use. Same is true with cats. So this particular pathway that I just said is called commensal pathway, in which a species just get attracted to humans because there is probably food. And then humans, for some reason that I don't know, don't have an incentive to kill them immediately. That results in animal not having the fear of approaching humans. There are other pathways. So there is a predator-prey pathway that most herd animals like cow and goat choose toward domestication. And that probably is more applicable to coordinated hunting between humans and not killing the vulnerable members of the herd. And probably trying to control that herd movements, even by providing them with the food that they need in a certain location.
What about the famous wild grasses that become the wheat, the barley, rice, beans, etc.? What's the link? Because I know that you suggest there is a link. This is not just a story of why Eurasia, the southern band of Eurasia, ends up having all these domesticable animals, but also why this is part of the story of why they end up having the most domesticable plant species. What's the link?
So in the ice age environment, because of the climate of the ice age, those environments favored generally a physiological trait associated with large body size. It favored movements of big species, and then all the smaller species, plants, the other animals, humans, really depended on these key ecosystem engineers, large mammals, for survival, for meat, for byproducts. Plants use this animal particularly for the diffusion, dispersal of genes.
I see. So the seeds would travel in the belly of the mammoth for long distances.
The ancestor of the cow probably had the function that they ate a lot of grass, they moved, and they spread the seeds. So that was the dispersal mechanism for the plants.
Interesting.
What happened when these key species become less available? They became less available starting around 20 to 30,000 years ago, partly because of human impacts, plant species that depended on these, like the wild grasses, the flowering plants that later became domesticated plant species. They started recruiting humans as the dominant niche constructors, because if you depend on a species for seed dispersal and that the species is gone, you're going to look for an alternative. Who's there? Humans.
Yeah. But of course, given that plants are not consciously doing their Darwinian calculus, what does this look like in practice? Does it mean that that a lot of these grass species start to suffer, start to die out because they don't have the mechanism available?
Yes.
And then the few of those who might have had some kind of existing relationship with humans suddenly start blossoming because now they are the ones who have the evolutionary edge. Is that kind of what we should imagine if we think of the actual mechanism?
I would guess yes. Mechanically, there's the survival of the most adaptable, Darwin's theory, which is like those species of plants who learn by probably accident or something to depend on humans can spread. Those who didn't have the chance or weren't able to became extinct.
So the reason then why this Eurasian band would have so many flowering grasses that have an existing, or at least are tuned to an existence with humans that are then make them suitable for becoming the wheat, the barley, the rice, the beans, whatnot, is because these are areas where where these have dependent on large mammals like the mammoth or whatever, or the other that some of them went extinct. Their numbers did reduce around 20,000 years ago during the last kind of peak of the ice age, of the last ice age. This did not happen in Africa.
At least to the extent that happened in Asia. In Africa, the large animal megafauna population was for the most part stable, meaning that there were probably pressure on them, but at least the evidence that we have is like very few species went extinct.
Yeah.
Just keep in mind, again, I want to just emphasize the fact that I'm not talking about the only reason for them. It's just these are all contributing reasons that are relevant because of continental variation.
What about Americas? In Americas, you had the dramatic reduction in megafauna. Wouldn't that mean that the wild grasses or whatnot in America would have had even more of an evolutionary push to depending on humans? Or does it mean that they just disappeared because the shock was too big, so they all just were wiped out? Could that be one of part of the theory?
They probably did. There probably was a lot of pressure from evolution point of view for both humans and plants to adapt to each other fast. And they did. There were, I think if you count the number of species that were domesticated, the number of species that were domesticated in the America is pretty large. It didn't happen at the same time that happened in Eurasia. Why much later? So two reasons. First, human got there much later. Second is that, plant species need to understand who they are dealing with, again, from an evolutionary perspective. Like, they didn't know this bipedal ape exists, and probably the seed is not that much palatable to human compared to a Eurasian species. The seed, like avocado, like you see, like this massive seed. Why do we have that massive seed? It's not evolved for human. It's evolved for the giant slot that died.
Yeah, so this is again the idea that, well, the grasses we find 15,000 years ago in Eurasia and America are not there just as a windfall, but in Eurasia, unlike in America, they have already been selected slowly by those humans, the meat man and everyone else, after running over them, eating them, dispersing them. And so that I mean, Diamond speaks about this fact that you have these large seeded grasses in Eurasia so much more than anywhere else that might have already been a product of humans walking over them, eating them, carrying them, depending on these wild grasses for much longer than we typically think, when we just focus on the fact that, well, there was a couple of hunter-gatherers who depended a little bit on maybe a little bit of wild cereals just before agriculture started.
Yes, you're exactly right. There is just evidence that Natufians were engaged in management of barley like pretty much around 15,000 years ago.
Yeah.
It means that barley was being consumed by humans in one shape or another, like way before, probably 80,000 years ago when humans were born.
Yes, it is. Yeah, yes, it is the common mistake of thinking that just this is where the evidence begins, so that's where the activity begins.
So I would say like a Eurasian species, they were more evolved to human digestive systems. So like, they could spread by movement of human, and human can use them. So they were like more evolved for human consumption compared to, let's say, avocado, which was just like designed for like a massive grown slot that walked around.
Yeah, true. The avocado seed does not go very far in the human stomach.
And even if you think about corn, like I don't know if you have seen ancestor of the corn that
yeah, the teosinte, yeah.
It does not look anything like the corn that we eat.
No. Fair amount of selection had to take place.
Yes.
I bet Darwin would have used that in The Origin of Species at the beginning if he would have had information.
Oh, he did. I think he did. I don't know if it's corn, but like he started The Origin with talking about domesticable stuff.
No, exactly. And I thought that if he would have the pictures of teosinte to corn that we have, that would have been a great way to kickstart birds. Okay, and so basically, am I right that the suggestion is that Africa and Eurasia had the plants, for example, that were for a long time probably being consumed by humans, and unlike America. But then Eurasia, unlike Africa, because it did start having the megafauna, big mammals, their population started declining, first slowly, then rapidly, which then put, first of all, emphasis on humans in managing these animals themselves. Okay, they start to evolve more in the kind of dance with humans. And also these grasses, for example, start to depend more on humans and not on these animals to carry their seed around. And lo and behold, we get the agricultural revolution first in this southern band of Eurasia. We get the quote-unquote first civilizations. We get high population densities for millennia. We get trade, we get war, we get weapons from these animals, we get germs, and hence Eurasia.
Yes, this is a very broad story, and there's like lots of interesting details missing there, but I just want to say nothing in that process was certain. At any point during this process, it's just Eurasia kept the first of those innovation increased the likelihood of the later innovation, and so on and so on.
Eurasia had the zip code that was more likely to send.
In a sense, we always had rich parents.
Yes. Chef was the kid with the rich parents. Good. Well, I think that's a great place to start coming to a close. Is there something that you would have wanted to talk about that we haven't so far?
I'm really looking forward to the episodes that he said on your website going to do about niche construction and extended synthesis. I really think those stories are fascinating.
Yeah, why don't we give for listeners a quick? I mean, you've talked about this way in which the animals and plants evolved, and then they meet humans. But there was this way in which humans affected the evolution, not necessarily consciously, but by their actions, they ended up impacting these creatures. Humans created their niche in a way where they can rely on certain kinds of animals and plants. This is part of what you just mentioned, the word extended evolutionary synthesis.
Yes.
Which stands in contrast to the modern evolutionary synthesis, maybe most famously popularized by Dawkins' selfish gene. So, why don't we, before we finish, maybe we can give a quick kind of theoretical pause for those who are interested in biological theory. What is the extended evolutionary synthesis?
I'm going to talk about it in terms of the topic we talked about, so that it's related to what we just said. It's just one thing. Extended evolutionary synthesis is not in contrast to the modern evolution. Or
You're right. I did use the wrong word. It is not. Yes.
it's just an extension of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, like, in the simplest possible way is this, like, think about residential agriculture and domestication. Like, when people were trying to explain to this what, like, the operating framework of evolution for the most part, for a lot of people still is the standard evolutionary theory that we have learned in biology classes. So that the story goes that environment changes the most adaptable for survive and reproduce. So this is a theory of fundamentally based on Darwin, natural selection. So in terms of agriculture, generally a story goes that human adapted to new climate, which resulted in agriculture. This is a really powerful story, but it needs a lot of questions behind. One of them is the fact that we need to explain, for example, geographic patterns of domestications. So there are other theories that extend this idea. And the idea is that humans just are not just like a passive reactors to the environment. We change the environment perhaps more than any other species systematically, so that instead of re-changing so that we can fit in the environment, we make the environment so that our fitness in that environment increases. So those changes in the environment is called niche construction. So that we change the environment so that our fitness increases in those environments. And from the theoretical, deep evolutionary biology perspective, these stories have different implications about, for example, direction of evolution and speed of evolution. But when it comes to human migration, when it comes to agriculture, you can explain all of these things that are just with modern evolutionary synthesis and natural selection. But I really find the framing of the question and answer that happens within this newer extended evolutionary theory much more easily understandable, and it's also provide a better guide when it comes to statistical analysis and inferring causal relationship, which becomes a really problematic thing sometimes. If you're not dealing with the right evolutionary framework, you might see something and assume which is a causal relationship.
Well, can you give an example of that? How would that look like in this context of getting the causality wrong?
So, for example, like, there are theories by economists that says, like, one reason about why Eurasia became Eurasia is the fact that there was something about Eurasian genetics. For example, like the genetic composition of Eurasian population in terms of diversity and how much they were familiar genetically kind of like made those populations more prone to innovations throughout history currently.
Yeah, I've had Oleg Galor on the show. I think it's worth highlighting. He's not saying that the Eurasians were genetically smarter.
No, it's just the composition of population.
Yeah, so he's saying that the Africans are genetically more diverse. Native Americans are genetically much less diverse, and so he sees this as a kind of like optimum level of diversity where you have a bit more similarities, but also a bit more pluralism than in the alternative extremes.
Yeah, well, like, see, if you find an uncomfortable result as scientists, you believe in that result, we should stick by it. So if somebody presents evidence that says some aspects of human nature or human population attributed to Eurasia's fast development, and if those evidence is acceptable, we should all accept it.
Yeah, but I do have to say, I don't think he has very strong evidence for this. I mean, all there is a correlation. And you could make the same case about anything like, we have statistical evidence suggesting that the European nose shape has been conducive to economic success since the 1500s. I mean, you could run the correlation and figure that out. And, so I do find, I really like Galor's book, Journey of Humanity, but I do think that part of his theory I felt was probably the most far-fetched. And I'm a bit sad that I didn't push back more against when he said that we have, for example, been able to demonstrate that the optimum level of diversity was in Eastern Asia at this time. I don't think there's any evidence suggesting that there's a causal link.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's actually how I got into this sort of research. The idea, if you think about it, like, it's like one of the main reasons for our genetic differences at the aggregate level is the patterns of human migration. I'm not going to go deep into it, so because we probably...
Yeah, there's a lot of diversity in the original population, and then you take away a little bit of it further. So that by the time you get to Argentina, you have very little of diversity left, and you have a homogeneous genetic population.
Yeah, and those economists who argue for the impact of genetic variation on economic performance at an aggregate level, they really focused on just one aspect. Like, they were like, change in human population. While my research shows that, human everywhere they went, they had a significant impact on the environment. And the only way to say aggregate genetic differences between human population matters is to say that human migration had no other impact on anything. So my theory provided a strong connection between what Diamond said and human out of Africa migration. It shows that, going back to where we started, Diamond started his book by saying changes differences in levels of economic development rooted in the environment, not in biological differences between population. My work provide everything that I've seen and I've done, confirming Diamond's original insight.
Yeah. I think there's a really good example of that in one of your papers. I think this was your job market paper originally, where and there is this finding that the more genetically close a country is to, I think, US, the proximity to US correlates with economic, I don't know, was it GDP per capita or something?
Yeah, something.
And there's many ways to take that. I mean, there's a kind of like overtly racist way to take that. The authors don't take that path. What they suggest is just that being genetically similar to wherever the technological frontier is means that it's easier for these ideas to diffuse to your country. And you show that if you take into account everything that we've discussed today, you don't have a statistically significant correlation there.
Right. Like, no, it is possible. Like, I'm sure, like, we have evidence that certain genes make us more prone to certain diseases. So, of course, human genetics matter. Everybody agrees that genes matter. But from there to saying aggregate differences in human history in level of technological innovation what is happening now in terms of income inequality and per capita are explained by genetic, that's like a completely different story. That's like requires significantly stronger evidence that does not currently exist, and I'm pretty sure it never gonna exist.
Yeah, and I do think it's one of those cases where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and one correlation is not exactly that. But yes. But no, thanks for all your work showing an alternative way to read those results and sticking to diamonds. I think important project.
Thank you.
Before we finish, final question I always ask my guests is, how has all your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
It's interesting, like a lot of time, like, when things happening in the world and people are like, this world is like, I can't believe there's something wrong with the world. It's particularly difficult time. Like, and I always try to tell people, like, you do not know the hardship our ancestors faced and the horrors in some cases that our ancestral population faced. I'm like, I think it's just a miracle that we exist as a species, given the amount of coincidence and accident and chance that was required for us to get to this point. So I'm in the long term, I've become more optimistic about our ability to solve problems, of course, with a lot of cost. I'm thinking about things like climate change and the changes in the Earth's ecosystem. Yeah, it's awkward. Like, these extended sentences and niche construction, it tells us that it's an opportunity. This is an extinction battle. From the extinction battles of the past, we invented agriculture, not unintentional. And I'm really eager to see from this extinction problem what's going to come out of it. Probably new ways of thinking about the world and relating to each other, and institutional innovation that can help us solve our problem. I'm looking forward to that.
Ideen, Riahi, thank you so much for your research and your time today.
Thank you, Larry. It was a great time. I enjoyed our talk. We should do this more often.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you want to continue this kind of exploration, I highly recommend checking episodes 12 and 13 with Oded Galore, the author of Journey of Humanity, also an economist who takes a somewhat broadly similar approach, but with different theories. And if you're new to On Humans and you'd enjoyed this, then definitely do subscribe to stay tuned with future episodes on the show. And as always, if you do enjoy the idea of supporting the show a little bit, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans to pledge a small sum monthly, which really, really does help. Absolutely no pressure. Just if you feel like it would be something that fits your life situation, you can hop off, of course, at any time. Anyway, that's it for today. Until next time, take care.